Welcome back to the daily Rambam class. It's not Thursday, it's Wednesday, but I'm filling in for Rabbi Heft. He will be giving the class tomorrow. And let's do what we usually do on a Thursday, and that is just to see where we are up to in the Rambam in general. We are now in the 6th volume of the Rambam that deals with promises. And within that 6th volume, there are 4 subjects. By the talk the other night, last Saturday night, a week and a half ago, we mentioned how there's a total of 83 subjects in the Rambam. So the 83 subjects are found throughout these 14 volumes. You could do the maths. I guess if it's 83 and there's 14 volumes, so it's approximately 5 or so subjects per volume. And this volume, the 6th volume, the Book of Promises, has 4 subjects, and we've now moved on to the 4th and final subject. And this particular subject has 8 chapters. If you want to just see what these 8 chapters speak about, the first 3 chapters speak about pledges relating to people. The next 2 chapters speak about pledges relating to fields. The next chapter speaks about different types of donations, if they exist or who they belong to, and all types of scenarios. And finally, the last 2 chapters speak about if a person did make his property holy for the temple, how can that property be redeemed? So here we are, the 6th volume, the 4th subject of that volume, and we are up to chapter 2. It's a short chapter, an interesting chapter. Let's get at it. So, starting with people. If a person says, I pledge the erech of my hand, my eye, my foot, or that person's hand, that person's eye, his words are of no consequence. So in other words, if he's saying that I'm giving that guy's hand, his foot, erech, when the Torah speaks about the word erech, which could mean value, it's a word that's used referring to a person in his totality. And since it was just a hand, it's of no consequence. If he says, I pledge the erech of my heart or my liver, or that person's heart or that person's liver, then he needs to pay the entire erech. Certainly with regards to any limb which is removed, which would cause the person to die, but it says, I pledge its erech, he must pay the erech of the entire person. Since the person's life depends upon those limbs, it says, if he said, I'm giving the erech of the person. If a person says, I pledge half my erech, so then he needs to give half his erech, which would be half his value. Now, when you say half his value, I'm sure it was explained in yesterday's chapter that the Torah is not, God forbid, saying that one person is more valuable than another. Rather, the Torah says, when a person says that an erech of a person is giving to the temple, this is what it means. As far as if a person was sold in the marketplace as a slave, how much would he be able to produce? So it's in that limited capacity. It's not certainly valuing people in general. So if he says half of my erech, it means half of what he would be worth in the marketplace. If he says I pledge the erech of half of myself, so then we said you can't give a part of a person, you can only give a whole person. But since half of himself, his life is dependent upon, therefore he needs to give the value of his whole self. So that's all that he used the word erech, which is a word that's used to people in their totality. If he didn't use the word erech, but rather he said demei, the money of, or the value of, I pledge the worth of my hand, the worth of so-and-so's hand, then we evaluate how much is that person worth with a hand, and how much would he be worth without a hand, and the difference would be given to the Beis Hamikdash or to the temple treasury. What do we mean? What is the person worth with a hand or without a hand? If he was sold to the marketplace as a slave, a servant, so he will be worth, let's say, 50 cents. But if he was sold with the original owner saying, I still hold on to, I'm only selling him with the exception of his hands. So whatever his hands do, go to me. Whatever anything else does, goes to you. So that's how you would determine the difference. So if, for example, the person being sold without the use of his hands would only be worth 40, then it means that if a person has said, I'm giving the value of a hand, then he needs to give 10. And the same would follow in all other situations. If a person says, I pledge the worth of my head, or my liver, or I pledge the worth of so-and-so's head, or so-and-so's liver, so here, although he's using the words debay, worth, unlike the first two halachas where he said Eireh, so since he is pledging a liv that the person's life is dependent upon, he needs to give the whole person. It's actually a matter of debate in the Talmud, if I remember correctly. And the Rambam rules, could be the Gemara already rules this way, that since I think there's a doubt, he needs to give it all. Similarly, if one says, I pledge the worth of half myself, he needs to pay his entire worth. Whenever he says, I pledge half my worth, then you would only need to give half. Okay, now let's talk about, these are interesting halachas, the ones that follow. Okay, if a person says, I pledge my weight, or I pledge the weight of so-and-so. You know, there's a guy that everybody knows is really big, and he says, you know what I'm giving to the Beis HaMikdash? I'm giving the weight of Yankel Shmerel. Whoa, wow, that's a lot. If he specified his weight in silver, he should pay in silver. If in gold, he should pay in gold. So if he says, I am going to give the weight of Yankel Shmerel in gold to the Beis HaMikdash, then so be it. If he said, I pledge the weight of my arm or my leg, we see how much it would weigh, and he must pay the money that he specified. Now, when we say arm, what does arm mean? It means, in this context, until the elbow, and the leg, in this context, is until the knee, because when it comes to vows, we follow what people refer to. And in this context, that's what they mean. Because a hand could also be that, or it could be maybe the whole hand. But in this context, generally, it's just that part. And the same would go for the foot. If a person says, I pledge my height in silver or in gold, so he needs to give a scepter of his height that will stand straight without bending from the type of metal he specified. So if the guy is 6 foot tall, then he needs to give a golden rod that's 6 foot tall. Now, he doesn't say the thickness of the rod, but maybe there were standards on how thick scepters were. If he said, I pledge the extent of my height, he may give even a scepter that will bend from the type of metal he specified. Adding the extra term extension of indicates that he is deviating from the ordinary manner in which the term would be explained. I guess it's thinner material. So this is where he does go into the thickness. It's thinner that it could bend. If he just says by height, then it means it should be strong enough that it could stand by itself. If he says the extent of my height, that it could be even if it wouldn't be thick enough to stand straight, unless he would need to hold it in place. If a person says, so the next 4 halachas, vague pledges, and that brings us to the topic that I put on the group. If a person's not sure what his donation was it in dollars, was it in rands? It makes a difference. So he said, my father was once at a shul by an uncle overseas, and they would auction off the aliyahs, I think every Shabbos, and my father was blown away. I mean, the numbers that were flying in the thousands, in the 10,000. This is just an ordinary Shabbos. You know, this is insane. Until afterwards, other guys told him, no, they pledge in cents. I guess it feels good. So there was talking in the thousands, the 10,000s. So here we're not sure what the guy meant. So if he is very wealthy and obviously intended to give a substantial donation, he should give his weight in gold. So again, what was the scenario? He said, I pledge my weight, but he didn't say out of which material. If the guy, he's up there, and you know, when he gives, it's in gold, so then that's in gold. Similarly, if such a person says, I pledge the weight of my arm, the weight of my leg, or my height, without specifying the substance from which he will give, he should give gold. If, however, the donor is not exceedingly wealthy, he should give his weight or the weight of his hand from any substance which is commonly weighed in that locale, even fruits. Okay, so he says, I give my weights to the shul or to the Beis HaMikdash. He could go and buy a sack of potatoes, And if that could be intended with weight, then that will be his donation rather than a sack of gold. He says fruits. So maybe a better example would be a sack of oranges. Similarly, he should give a scepter as tall as he is from any substance, even from wood. If he says, I give a scepter, but he didn't say of what substance, okay, it could be a wooden cane. Everything depends on his wealth and our assessment of his intent. More along those lines, when a person uses any of the following expressions, I pledge my standing, my sitting, the place where I sit, my width, my thickness, or my circumference. His intent is a matter of question, and there is doubt regarding his obligation. Hence, he should be required to give generously according to what could be expected of a person of his means until he says, sorry, this is not what I intended. You've gone over. If he dies, then it's different, because when we expropriate property from an heir, then we take the least amounts necessary. So then that would give the minimum that he could have intended. When a person says, I pledge a silver coin, he should not give less than a silver dinar, because they're different size coins. When he says, I pledge a brass coin, he should not give less than a brass coin worth a silver bar. I pledge iron. Now, usually the only thing that iron would be used for in the Beis Hamikdash was this particular piece of iron that was 1 cubit by 1 cubit, that would be used as a blade to prevent the ravens from standing on top of the Beis Hamikdash and making a mess. Even today you often have that issue of bird droppings, and they have different mechanisms to prevent it. So already in the Beis Hamikdash, they had this piece of iron that would prevent the ravens from standing there. So he's saying if he was giving iron to the Beis Hamikdash, that must be what he intended. When he says, I pledge silver or gold without mentioning the word coin, so then he should give a slab of silver or a slab of gold of significant weight until he says, this is not what I intended. Similarly, if he explicitly mentioned the weight of silver or gold, but forgot how much he specified, so he said a certain amount, but he doesn't remember what it was, then he should give until he says, this is definitely not what I had in mind. And finally, the last 3 halachas, whether the person says, I pledge my worth, or I pledge the worth of so-and-so, or whether one says, I pledge a mana, 50 silver or gold, they are all called monetary obligations. So as long as he uses the word worth, then it's monetary obligations. Or if he says, I pledge a mana, not worth, but he actually gives money, or it's gold, silver. Both halachim and monetary obligations are given towards capital improvements for the temple, as explained. There was a special fund that would be used to pay for the costs of keeping the temple up to stand. There were 2 chambers in the temple. One was called the chamber of the secret gifts, and the other the chamber for vessels. The chamber of secret gifts was given that name because sin-fearing men made donations there secretly, and poor people of distinguished lineage received their stuff from there secretly. The chamber of vessels, quite interesting, was given that name because anybody who had anything to donate, an iPad, a washing machine, whatever, or maybe that's a bit big, but either way, whatever they had to donate, they would throw it in there. And once every 30 days, the treasurers would open up and they'd see what could actually be used in the Beis Hamikdash, and the rest of the stuff would be sold, and they would use the money for the physical improvements. Now that we know there are different funds, can you borrow from one fund to another? This is a common question even today. If a shul has different funds for different functions, can you take funds out of one area and place them in another? So the principle is you could only upgrade, you can't downgrade in holiness. So therefore, if they needed additional funds for the actual korbanos, the actual sacrifices, and they didn't have enough, then they're allowed to take from the funds that are there for the improvements of the temple, but not vice versa. If they don't have enough funds for the improvements of the temple, they cannot take funds that are dedicated for korbanos. Maybe a modern application of that would be if you, if a shul, let's say, needs money to make renovations, then they can't, let's say, but they have extra sidurim, they wouldn't be allowed to sell the sidurim to use the money to make the renovations because the siddur is holier than the actual bricks. But vice versa, they would. If they had extra funds towards maintenance and they didn't have enough sidurim, then they would be allowed to use those maintenance funds to buy some more sidurim.